Forge Park Alliance. Thank you for joining us tonight for the fifth event in our 2020-2021 speaker series, sponsored by the Sharon H. and Bruce A. Bachman Foundation. I believe I saw most of you about 2 weeks ago at our talk by Kathleen Brown. Because of your attendance at that talk on January 5th, we were able to present a stretch goal talk tonight featuring historian Don Hagist. Thank you all for making this possible, and we're excited to have you with us again so soon. First, a little Zoom housekeeping. Since we have several presenters and panelists this evening, I recommend that you put your Zoom session in speaker view. There is an icon in the upper right portion of your Zoom screen that should allow you to toggle between speaker view and gallery view. Speaker view is less distracting as it allows you to see only who is currently presenting. There will be a Q&A following our Zoom webinar. Feel free to use the Q&A chat feature anytime during the event, and our speaker will answer your questions at the end. You can find the Q&A chat icon on the bottom portion of your Zoom window. Now I would like to introduce our moderator. Park Ranger and historian Eric Schnitzer is the leading authority on Lieutenant General Sir John Burgoyne's ruinous 1777 campaign, ending in the British surrender of Saratoga. He has interpreted at Saratoga National Historical Park for more than 20 years. Throughout his tenure, Eric has carried out exhaustive research, carefully analyzing numerous eyewitness accounts among British, German, and American participants of the campaign. In 2019, Eric partnered with artist Don Troiani to co-author the groundbreaking book, Campaign to Saratoga, 1777, a nuanced narrative history brought to life with original artwork and photographs of surviving historical artifacts. Eric earned his degrees in history and fine art from the University at Albany in 1998, and he brings a depth of knowledge to all his work. As a well-established member of the living history reenacting community, he has become a remarkable resource to those seeking to recreate the material culture of the British Army during the Revolutionary War era. He is the founder and commander of the recreated 62nd Regiment of Foot Light Infantry Company, and he takes a leading role in many annual reenactments. Frequently, he gives talks on his research, overturning many well-established myths in the process. He approaches every project with empathy, critical analysis, and a much-needed commitment to accuracy. And we're so pleased he agreed to be our moderator this evening. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was a very kind introduction. I've known Don Hagist for many years now. I think it's measurable in decades. When I first started researching primary source material on the British Army and the American War for Independence and looking at what other people have researched and written about, Don Hagist's name kept popping up a lot. And I recognized the quality of his research and writing very clearly. His research was based on analytics, which is very important. It's a very left brain sort of study. And I was absolutely impressed. Analytics, analysis, able to weed out anecdotes that were incorrect versus things that really needed to be looked at. Don was just an absolute brilliant guy with collecting information and coming to fantastic conclusions of the type that so many people hadn't really noticed before, different conclusions on things, very important things. So I contacted Don again many years ago, and we struck up, I think, a firm friendship based upon our mutual interests, i.e. the British Army during the American War for Independence period. Don Hagist has written a lot of books. This book that he'll be talking about today is not his first one. He's written many books, some of which include The Revolution's Last Men. There's also Wives, Slaves, and Servant Girls, British Soldiers, American War. Now that book, very clearly related to the book Don will be talking about today, that book takes 9 different British soldier accounts, memoirs, soldiers later in life writing their stories about their experiences in the British Army in the American War for Independence. So not officer journals, there's plenty of those, but rather the experiences of soldiers. And Don, through decades of hard backbreaking research has become the world's foremost expert on the British soldier's experience in the American War for Independence. There are other books out there that focus on other subjects related to the British Army in the, say, latter half of the 18th century or in the Revolutionary War in particular, and they're fantastic. But Don's work on the British soldier is second to none. Of course, the latest book, Noble Volunteers, the British soldiers who fought the American Revolution, is the ultimate tome for the subject at hand. You know, in my work at Saratoga National Historical Park, every Wednesday on our Facebook page, I publish an account, I would call it an obituary, of an American Continental Army soldier or officer who fell in the battles of Saratoga, died in the battles of Saratoga. And I create like a biography for them because these guys never had an obituary. You know, they died, they were buried without a gravestone, and there they are, even to this day. So my task is to go about and research what I can of their lives, soldiers and officers alike. And during the course of my work over the past few years, I have become absolutely shocked, frankly, by the number of Continental Army soldiers who were drafted from the population. Now, I always knew that part of the Continental Army was comprised of draftees. I had no idea how many there were. I couldn't tell you a percentage because nobody knows for sure. The research is yet to be done. But the truth is, a substantial portion of the Continental Army that was at Valley Forge or that fought, let's say, in the battles of Saratoga a couple months previously was comprised of drafted men. You wouldn't expect that because the stereotype is that they're all volunteers serving for altruistic reasons. And certainly some of them were, many of them were, perhaps most of them were, but there were a lot of draftees. Juxtapose that with Don Hagist's new book, Noble Volunteers. You wouldn't think that a book on the British soldiers in the Revolutionary War would be called Noble Volunteers. Weren't they all pressed men? Weren't they all drafted off the streets, had no choice but to serve? Well, I think Don Hagist is here to tell us more about that in his book, Noble Volunteers, the British Soldiers Who Fought the American Revolution. I present Don Hagist.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. And that was truly a humbling introduction. I hope that I can present some information that's worthy of that right now. You did use words like analytics a lot, and so I will try not to make this too flat and boring. And I think it'll be okay because really what excites me about this whole topic is not so much the analytics. You know, I use a lot of analysis to understand the topic. But what really gets me excited about this topic is the people, the individual people who made up the British Army. When I look at an army like this, I don't see it in terms of 5,000 men here and 2,000 men there. I think of it in terms of individual people, and I want to know what happened to every single one of them. We've got this picture on the book cover, and it shows 5 men sitting around a fire, 6 men and 3 of their wives. And I want to know who each one of them is because they all came from somewhere and they all served in the army for a portion of their lives and they did something else later on. And that's the part that fascinates me. So the analytics and the metadata just helps to put the individuals into context. Now I have this book called Noble Volunteers, and it's about 332 pages long. So I'm going to spend about the first half of this presentation talking about the title. And the title is kind of important because it gets to the heart of the book, Noble Volunteers, the British Soldiers Who Fought the American Revolution. Well, first let's look at that subtitle, The British Soldiers Who Fought the American Revolution. I'm having a little bit of trouble. There we go. Now the slides are advancing. So the book is about soldiers, and it's important to recognize up front that I don't talk very much about officers in this book. In fact, I don't really talk about the officers at all. I talk about the rank and file soldiers, the privates, the drummers, the fifers, the corporals, and the sergeants. And when you're in the British Army during this time period, you're not an officer, that's all the ranks you get. There aren't any specialists or much of anything besides that. So this is the entire focus of the book is on the common soldiers. Other people write about officers. There are a few men of those ranks who became officers, and I talk a lot about that subject in the book, but again, their careers as officers is not the focus here. Also, the book is focused on infantry. Well, that's because during the American Revolution, the British government sent quite a lot of regiments of their army over to America, but they were almost all infantry. They sent only 2 cavalry regiments to America. And there's a little bit of discussion of cavalrymen here and there, but mostly this is about the lives of the infantry, the backbone of the British Army. And the emphasis throughout this book, looking at all these soldiers, is not on trying to look at them and say, what did all these men have in common? But I want to know how they were all different from each other. So the emphasis here is on diversity. I don't try to reduce it down and say a typical career of a sergeant was like this, but rather say, look at all the different kinds of careers somebody in that role might have had in the Army. Now, there's other books about the British Army during this time period. These 2 are great books, but look at these titles: Redcoat, The British Soldier in the Age of Horse and Musket, and The British Soldier in America. And I look at these titles and I said, The British Soldier. So there's only one, is there? Well, that's exactly what I want to try to get away from. Again, these are good books, but I really want to focus on the fact that there were many British soldiers, many types of people, many backgrounds, many different careers. Now, the main title of the book is Noble Volunteers, and right away, everyone asked that question. Eric mentioned this in the introduction. Volunteers? What are we really talking about here? Well, during this time period, the 1760s and 70s and 80s is when all these men joined the Army. Remember, the American Revolution, the fighting began in 1775. But a lot of the soldiers in the British Army were already in the Army long before that. So we're looking at joining the Army in the 1760s and 70s. There were 4 ways to join the Army during this time period. You could enlist voluntarily. You could be born into the Army, so your father's a soldier, and you choose to become a soldier. You could get into the Army as an alternative to prison, or you could be impressed into the Army. This is the type of thing that Eric called drafting, which is a little more harsh if you're in the British Army at this time period. And we'll talk about these things in the reverse order of how they're presented here. So let's start with impressment. Well, impressment was a way you could get into the British Army during the time of the American Revolution, but it wasn't a way you could get into the Army at any time during the American Revolution. The British government established a Press Act for the Army only between June 1778 and May 1780. Now, it actually started right at the very end of May 1778, the 25th or 28th, I think. So effectively, only between these time periods was the Army allowed to press men into service. Now remember, the American Revolution began in 1775, Battle of Saratoga, 1777. Press Act doesn't even come into effect until 1778. There were strict rules around impressment. It was limited to certain locations in Great Britain and certain seasons of the year. And during the time the Press Act was in effect, no more than 10% of all of the men recruited during this time period were in fact pressed men. Now, not 10% of the entire Army, but 10% of the men who were new recruits during this 2-year period of an 8-year war. Now, of those men that were 10% of all the recruits, only about 5% of those recruits were actually sent to serve in America. Remember, June 1778 to May 1780, France is involved in the war. Spain is involved in the war. There's fighting going on in Gibraltar. There's fighting going on in India. There's even fighting going on in Nicaragua during this war. So a lot of these men who are pressed, which again isn't a lot to begin with, are sent to other places besides North America. So we have one batch of recruits sent to America in 1779, only about 5% of them, which works out to be fewer than 100 men, were pressed men. Actually, I think it was about 120, sorry. So it works out that pressed men, men who were compelled to serve in the British Army during the American Revolution, were only about 1% of the soldiers, less than 1% of all of the soldiers in America who served in the war. So if we think about, you pick up a book and it talks about soldiers being pressed into the army, it's like, well, okay, that's true. Men were pressed into the army, but not very many. If you think about the British Army as a whole, impressment is almost meaningless when you talk about the war in America. Hardly any of the men who served in America during the American Revolution were pressed. So far, we know about only 9 regiments who received pressed men at all, and in any one of those regiments, about 37 of the men were impressed. That's the most we know in any regiment. A regiment, by the way, is about 500 men. The numbers varied, but if you see the word regiment and you think, okay, that's about 500 men, you'll be in the ballpark. So any one regiment, the most pressed men in it, 37 men, that's not even 5%, right? If I'm doing the math in my head correctly, don't check me on that. Let's go to the next slide before anybody does. So the first way you could get in the army was impressment, but it was highly unlikely, hardly any pressed men. Well, let's look at the next way to get in the army as an alternative to prison. It was possible for someone who was given a prison sentence to be given the alternative to go into the army instead. Now, this was the magistrate's choice about whether he gave a soldier that option or not, or gave a person that option or not. And it was only given as an option when people were charged with petty crimes, misdemeanors, bigamy, petty theft, burglary, failure to pay child support. These are the kinds of crimes that magistrates looked at and said, let's offer this person the opportunity to go into the army instead of going to jail. You don't find the murderers and the grand theft people, the violent criminals, being offered the option of going into the army. Why not? Why would the army want people like that? They weren't very good members of society. They're probably not going to be good members of the army. And the regiments had the right of refusal of these men. So a man might be offered the choice to go into the army instead of prison. But if the army itself says, we don't want that guy, then he doesn't get into the army. Looking at court records from Great Britain during the time of the American Revolution, we find that only a few hundred men were offered this option during the war. Now, we don't know exactly how many, and we don't know what regiments they went into. We don't know how many served in America, but if we have only a few hundred altogether, then we can reckon that very few actually made it into the American Revolution. And even if we look at this as a way to get into the army, it was still voluntary in that the man who was charged and sentenced to prison was given the option of serving in the army, and it was his choice whether he wanted to do it or not. So it's sort of a crude form of voluntary enlistment. But the whole point of bringing it up is to point out that hardly any soldiers got into the army this way compared to the size of the army as a whole. So we have hardly any pressed men. We have hardly any men who came in as an alternative to prison. What's another way to get into the army? Well, maybe your father's in the army. And armed regiments in the army traveled from place to place, stayed for long periods of time. Wives were allowed to accompany their husbands, and naturally, children are born. And they too are part of the army in a way. They travel with the army. And from this little nursery, wrote one military writer, some excellent non-commissioned officers may be produced. Sure, if a child is born and raised in the army, by the time he's old enough to be a soldier himself, he's probably pretty good at knowing what goes on in the army and how the system works. Now, we don't know how many soldiers who served in the American Revolution were born in the army. I've been able to identify some. And again, the book gives a lot of detail about all these subjects and gives some numeric information. But another point to be made here is even for somebody born in the army, it was their choice. Once a young man comes of age, he is allowed to join the army. It might be a very attractive option if it's all he knows in life, but it's certainly not a requirement. And I tell the story in the book of one young man who was born in Brunswick, New Jersey in 1760, if I recall correctly. And eventually he and his family were involved in the American Revolution. His father was a sergeant. When he turned 17, he chose not to join the army. So we've got 3 ways to join the army: impressment, alternative to prison, born in the army. And what we recognized is that each of those ways of getting into the army brought hardly any men into the army compared to the size of the army. So what's the other way to get into the army? Well, that's to volunteer. And that encompasses almost all of the British soldiers who fought during the American Revolution. There was no other way to get into the army besides volunteering, except for these little special cases we've talked about. So how do you get volunteers to join the army? Well, you use a lot of good marketing, right? And if you read recruiting posters from the time period, you see good marketing copy. I've got a lot of examples in the book. Here's one right now: all gentlemen volunteers who are able and willing to serve in His Majesty's 45th Regiment of Foot and who have courage to fight for their country. On and on and on it goes. The 33rd Regiment of Foot put an advertisement in the newspaper in 1775, and they were looking for any able-bodied young man who is fired with ambition, has a roving disposition, and whose spirit soars above the dull sameness of staying at home. And on it goes, and then it adds near the end, those men only will be taken who promise to be a credit to their officers and an honor to their country. So they're looking for young, spirited men who want to do something different than just stay at home or stay in their same town and work on the farms and the fields, work as weavers and shoemakers and tailors. They want something different in their lives, and the recruiting language appeals to them. Now here's a poster for the 88th Regiment of Foot in 1780, I think it was. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but way down at the bottom, we've got this, at the top it starts, "Now is the moment, my noble-minded countrymen. Now is the crisis of our country's fate." Down at the bottom it says, "The sons of freedom are alone worthy to support the honor of old England, and the conduct of the noble regiment of British volunteers shall prove that Englishmen never wanted courage to defend their wives, their sweethearts, or their firesides." Oh my gosh, don't you all just want to run out and join the British Army right now after hearing that? Well, I might not want to do that, but I did look at this language and say, there's the title for my book, The Noble Regiment of British Volunteers, Noble Volunteers. That's what this book is about. So let's look at why some of these men might have enlisted. The downside here is that from 1767 to 1785, I've only been able to find so far 35 soldiers who actually left a written record saying why they joined the army. I could do all kinds of analytics about employment rates and other things to try to guess why people joined the army, but I might be wrong if I did that. What I really want is for people to tell me exactly why they joined, and hardly any soldiers did. We're looking at a time period here, a time span when something on the order of 200,000 men joined the army between those years, and I know why only 35 of them joined. Not enough to do statistics, but at least it's something. A couple of these men were pressed men, and we've already seen that that was a special case. Almost all of the men who wrote down their reason for joining the army were employed, had they already had a job or some other means of support when they joined the army. So right away, that leads some suspicion about men joining strictly because they were unemployed. Doesn't mean they didn't. It just means that so far, I can't find anybody who says that that's why they joined. No man who wrote down their reason for joining the army, who I've found so far, has left unemployment as a reason. Now, maybe we'll find one. When I first made this slide 3 months ago, it said 32 soldiers. And since then, thanks to help from my friends, I found data on 3 more. So the quest continues, but none of those guys gave unemployment as a reason either. Let's look at a few of the reasons here. I'm going to give about a dozen men here, so bear with me. It'll get a little tedious. William Crawford, who eventually served in the battle at Saratoga, but he initially joined the army as a dragoon, and he wrote that he did it because the king's golden guineas in the form of a bounty won my heart. Robert Hudson, who served in the 20th Regiment of Foot, who was also at Saratoga and who I haven't told Eric Schnitzer about yet, but I'll get to that later when I talk to him. He said he joined the army because by the fair speeches of the British officers, they brought us to believe that the army was the best place. So we've got, again, this marketing language. The recruiters convinced them that it was a good idea. John Pink joined the 33rd Regiment of Foot. He was persuaded by a young man that belonged to the army, another soldier, that the army was a very advantageous place for a tailor. John Pink was a tailor, and he was working, but somebody convinced him he could find even better work in the army. We have Robert Hall in the 43rd Regiment, joined not from want, but from inclination. So he says, well, I didn't really need the job, but I wanted to join the army. William Burke said, I had a wish to become a soldier. W. Griffith, whose first name we don't know, joined. He said, I could not resist it, though I could give no particular reason. Thomas Sullivan joined the 49th Regiment to satisfy an inclination so strongly bent on rambling. Andrew Scott said, well, joining the 80th Regiment of Foot afforded me an opportunity of seeing the world. He was a farm laborer in Scotland, wanted to do something different. Valentine Duckett, well, he had a good reason. My stepmother and I could not agree. So his father remarries, he doesn't like his stepmother, he runs away and joins the army. That's probably never happened since, right? Jonathan Sawyer joined the 52nd Regiment because he was disappointed in courtship. Again, all of these people, we talk more about them in the book, more detail here. James Andrew joined a Scottish regiment called a Fencible Regiment, was akin to a militia in Scotland, and he joined to be freed from the clamors of a wife. So we've got all kinds of reasons that are not the kinds of reasons you could guess at by looking at metadata and statistics and things that were going on in Great Britain during this time period. Everybody had a very individual and very personal reason for joining the army, and darn, I wish I knew more of them. But you do see some trends going on here, right? You see people making personal decisions for personal reasons. There were 3 periods of enlistment. I've got this book divided into 3 sections that I'll talk about in a minute, but within those sections, there are 3, count them, 3 chapters about enlistment in the British Army, which sounds like really more than one would need, but it's important because looking at the American Revolution, there were 3 distinctive phases of enlistment for men who served here in America, and the way that these men were their goals for why they joined the army may have been different. The ways that they were trained were different, and the way their careers progressed were different depending on when they enlisted. Oops, I keep going the wrong way here. Some of the men who fought in the American Revolution had enlisted during times of peace. So they enlisted before the war started. They may have enlisted 10 years before the war started. They had no idea they'd be going to America someday to fight in a war. They just joined the army as a career. These men served in the army until they were no longer fit for service, and talk a lot about what that means in the book. Then there were men who enlisted after the American War began, but during the first few years of the American War. Well, then they're joining when there's a war going on, but it's a war in America, and that's all. These men can join, and they don't have to serve until they're no longer fit for service. They might be eligible to be discharged from the army when the war is over, as long as they've been in the army at least 3 years. And one of the incentives that they're offered is once the war ends, if they want to, they can accept a land grant in America. Now, at the time they enlist in the army, the thinking is that this land grant will be in New York or Pennsylvania. Well, when the war ends, we have to change the rules a little bit, and these land grants end up being in Nova Scotia. But if you're a young Scottish farm worker tending somebody else's rocky soil in terrible weather, you join the army, you serve for 3 years, you get discharged, you go to Nova Scotia. Now you can start tilling rocky soil in terrible weather, but it's your own rocky soil, not somebody else's rocky soil. This is a pretty strong incentive. This might be the only way that a man in Great Britain could own land of his own. Now, once 1778 came around, things really changed a lot because France joined the war. And as we said, then Spain joined the war, and then Holland joined the war. Everybody joined the war all of a sudden. So Great Britain, who had been fighting a war for 3 years in America, 3,000 miles away, now has an enemy that they can see on a clear day. So they have some of the same parameters above, but enlistment bounties, the bonus money that you get when you join the army, increases. And also during this time, the Press Act went into effect because the need for manpower was so great. Again, the Press Act wasn't put into effect to fight the Americans. It was put into effect much more to fight the French. So there are three different ways men could, three different time periods and differences in how men were recruited and how they were trained and ended up serving in America here. The book is in three parts. I start with a peacetime army that prepares for war. The second part is the wartime army. And the third part is ending the careers and ending the war. Again, these phases are important. It's very important to remember that when the American Revolution began, all those British soldiers who were in America at that time didn't come here to fight a war. They were here already, and then a war started. This really changes your perspective on their careers in the army. So let's look a little bit. I'm just going to give a little tiny sample of the type of information that's in the book in each of these sections. So I'm just going to take one, what I consider to be an interesting point about each section. When we talk about preparing for war, we're talking about how men were recruited in times of peace. What incentives were given for men to join the army when there was no war going on. And here we also introduce a lot of basic things about the army, what nationalities men typically had, what age brackets men enlisted in and were typical within regiments in the army. We introduced the concepts of the ranks and how men were paid, how they were trained, what kind of career paths you'd have. Because to follow through with the rest of the material, you need some understanding of these things. So that's all introduced early on. And again, I try to discuss this all in terms of individual people and what happened to them. And then I talk about how the army trained in America in 1774 and early 1775. War started in 1775. There were soldiers here before that. Were they ready for the war, or was it a big surprise? Was it known that war was coming? Well, it turns out it was known that war was coming, or war might come. So they prepared for it. And I discuss this a lot. How do you train the 18th century British Army, all these soldiers who enlisted in times of peace? How do you train them to get ready for a possible war? Well, you bring them together in one place and you teach individual regiments how to work together in brigades. You take them for marches into the countryside for exercise. You give them lots of target practice. And in the meantime, they're getting harassed a great deal by local citizens, which is really going to affect their attitude toward fighting a war with those citizens. If people have been giving them a hard time for a year and a half, and then all of a sudden a war breaks out, you're liable to be less merciful, shall we say, than if all those people had been friendly all that time. We discussed this a lot in the war about the level of tension that soldiers were put under, a lot in the book rather. Now, I just said target practice, and if you've read a lot of books about the American Revolution, you've probably found at least one that says British soldiers were not taught to aim their muskets. In fact, you might find some that say British soldiers were taught not to aim their muskets, which is pretty wild because British soldiers by this time had been using muskets for 100 years, and people had figured out that you're more likely to hit something if you aim at it. And yet there's this mythos that British soldiers weren't taught to aim. So we talk about this. Not only were they taught to aim, but they practiced target shooting, and they practiced it a lot. The training manual that they used to learn how to shoot these weapons says right in it, when you're aiming it, the left eye should be shut and look along the barrel with the right eye from the breech pin to the muzzle. Well, that sounds an awful lot like aiming, doesn't it? This picture right here is from a British Army training manual of the time period. It identifies parts of the musket. Right up here on the end, there's a little thing. If you go to a historical reenactment and some guy is showing you his musket and you ask him what's that little thing on the end, he's probably going to call it a bayonet lug. to attach the bayonets to the musket. But if you look at a British Army training manual from this time period, it's letter E and letter E, that thing is called a sight, not a bayonet lug at all. And sure enough, British soldiers in Boston in the 4 months leading up to the outbreak of hostilities had fired target practice to the numbers of about 80 rounds for each man. If you fire black powder weapons, you'll know that 80 rounds is quite a lot in terms of gaining proficiency with a weapon. These things are not like modern firearms where 80 rounds is just one afternoon at the range. So these soldiers had done a lot of not just firing with live ammunition, but shooting at individual targets before the war broke out. Again, the book gets into a great deal more about how men were trained and prepared for war, but this is just one little example of the kinds of things we talk about. The wartime army. Well, we take into wartime recruiting and training, wartime tactics. How did the recruiting and training change when a war was going on? How did the army methods of fighting in the field change when the war was going on? Where did soldiers live when they were fighting a war and they were on campaign? What about food, hygiene, and health? I talk in here about the kinds of illnesses that we got in the Army. And as Eric had said earlier, I get into analytics. How likely were men to actually die of illness? What kind of illness did they die of? Did it change in the summer or winter? How likely were men to die of wounds in battle? And I talk about the kinds of things soldiers could do in their free time. I talk about how pay and promotion changed when soldiers were at war. Well, I'm sure everybody hung up on that thing, were wounds survivable? Because of course we think that medical procedures during the time period were very crude, right? Well, they were crude relative to today. But I looked at a lot of actual statistical information. I want to find out, well, how likely was a man to actually survive wounds that he received in battle? So I've got the 22nd Regiment. They fought in a big battle in Rhode Island on August 29th, 1778, just a few miles from where I'm sitting right now, in fact. And this regiment that had about 400 men involved in the battle had 11 men killed and 50 to 56 of them wounded, depending on which casualty return you looked at. That's quite a lot of casualties. It's quite a lot of wounded men from one regiment, well over 10%. But then I follow through and say, well, what happened after that? Fortunately, we have records that will tell us. We know for sure that one of those wounded men died from his wounds because we have a document that explicitly says it. But over the next 4 months, only 3 other men died. And we don't know why any of them died. So maybe they died of their wounds, maybe they got better and died for some other reason. But the point is that nobody else died. We had 50 men wounded, and no more than 4 of them died of their wounds, maybe even fewer than that. So wow, all of a sudden we say, golly, the chance of surviving a combat wound was a lot better than we might have guessed if we just speculated about it based on crude knowledge of the crude medical practices. There's a lot more data about this subject in the book, of course, but this is just one example, and it's an example of the kinds of things we discuss in here. And the third part of the book deals with ending careers. And we love to talk about soldiers and we love to talk about them in war, but then what happened to them? And of course, well, some of them died. Some of them died in the war. But there were other ways to end your career besides dying. You could desert from the army, and some men did that. Some men became prisoners of war, and then when the war ended and they were allowed to go home, they didn't go home. And it's challenging to find out what did happen to those men. We have soldiers who were displaced. Imagine, for example, a man who gets wounded in a battle in the New York area in 1776, and it takes him 1.5 years to recover from his wounds. But he finally recovers and he's released from the hospital, and now his regiment has been sent to some other place and he's still in New York. What happens to a man like that? Well, we talk about those kinds of things. Soldiers during the course of the war become too old or too infirm to serve any longer. What happens to those men? Well, they get discharged. And I talk a great deal about what happens to a discharged soldier. What are his prospects? A man joins the army at the age of 22 and serves for 15 years and maybe gets a minor wound and then he gets discharged. Well, what happens to him after that? I discuss all those things. Here's one example. 1783, the war is over. Britain has gone through a very big military buildup, increasing the size of its regiments, increasing the number of men serving as soldiers in America. Then a peace treaty is signed. The war is over. We don't need all these soldiers anymore. What do we do with them? Well, we give them options. The 22nd Regiment of Foot in September of 1783 discharged 66 men while they were still in America. So the regiment's in New York. They're going to go home. Guys have a choice of going home and then leaving the army, or staying in America and leaving the army. 66 men, while they're still in America, say, I'm leaving the army, taking my discharge. But what happens next? 47 of those 66 men immediately re-enlist in the army. And I say immediately, we're talking next day. They take their discharge, they're allowed to go home, do anything they want to do, but they re-enlist in the 54th Regiment of Foot, which is going to Canada. So they're staying on overseas service, again, completely voluntarily. They don't have to do it. But the army that so many people present as a bad career must be an attractive enough career that the vast majority of men who have the opportunity to leave at the end of an 8-year war turn around and re-enlist in order to stay and go to Nova Scotia, still in the army. So why would somebody do that? Well, I don't know, unfortunately. Not a single man who did this wrote down and told me what their reasons are, but there was an incentive. You re-enlist, you get another enlistment bounty, which at this time was about 2 months' pay. So, and there may be a host of other reasons why a man would make this choice. These are the kinds of career path things we talk in the book. And again, I talk about these things in the context of individual soldiers. So let me introduce you to a few individual soldiers. We have a few more minutes. I'm going to introduce you to 4 individuals who served in the British Army during the American Revolution. The first one is a man named Benjamin Noble. He was born in 1748 in Sandwich, Bedfordshire. He was a laborer, but as far as we can tell, he was illiterate in as much as he was not able to write his own name. He enlisted into the 14th Regiment of Foot in 1765, so 10 years before fighting broke out in America. That regiment was sent to Nova Scotia a year later, and then they were sent to Boston in 1768. They were in Boston at the time of the Boston Massacre, but none of their soldiers were involved in that event. After that, they were sent south, and Benjamin Noble went to war. There was a war in the Caribbean called the Carib War. It was a slave rebellion, and British soldiers fought there. Benjamin Noble was wounded there in 1773. Then his regiment was sent to Virginia in 1775. And he was wounded again at a battle called Great Bridge, Virginia. If you haven't heard of it, look it up. It was in many ways as important as the Battle of Bunker Hill, even though it was much smaller. Benjamin Noble was wounded there. So now he's been in the army for 10 years. He's got 2 wounds, but he stays in the army. His regiment gets sent home to Great Britain, but he doesn't go home. He joins a different regiment that stays in America, the 44th Regiment of Foot. He gets put into the Grenadier Company, and he is getting sent to join his brand new company of his brand new regiment that happens to be serving in New Jersey in January of 1777. And they literally march on their way to join their regiment. He and other of these men march right into the Battle of Princeton, and he's wounded again. So now he's racked up 3 wounds, but he is a career British soldier, and he continues to serve in the British Army through December of 1790 and receives a pension. This career is not the least bit unusual for British soldiers. In fact, it's a little bit on the short side. He served 25 years in the army. He was wounded 3 times in 2 different wars, but he was a career soldier. That's what he does. Let's look at another man, Peter Federheim. Well, that doesn't sound like a British name, right? And it wasn't. He was born in Mannheim, Germany. I use the term Germany generically, at this time, it was a set of principalities rather than a singular nation. He was 5 feet 9 inches high, light brown hair, gray eyes, fresh complexion. He was a Lutheran. He was recruited to serve in the British Army in late 1775, early 76. Now, he wasn't one of the people that we call Hessians, who was in a German army regiment sent to America. He was recruited to serve in the ranks of a British regiment in America. And he served in the 17th Regiment of Foot, which was also at the Battle of Princeton, but he himself didn't get involved. He was captured at the Battle of Stony Point in July of 1779, but he was exchanged afterwards. And then he was captured again at the Siege of Yorktown in October 1781, but he was repatriated at the end of the war. And then his career advanced. He became a corporal. He became a sergeant. He was discharged in 1802 and received a pension. So he'd been in the Army for 25 years, gets a pension. What does he do? Well, he does what thousands of British soldiers did in his situation. He's still on the young side. So he joined the Army again. He enlisted in the 60th Regiment of Foot. Discharged 4 years later, he went back on the pension rolls. And then what does he do? Well, he does what British soldiers do during this time period. He joined the Army again, this time in a veteran battalion, an organization that can't serve overseas, but it can serve to help protect coastal installations in Great Britain. And he finally gets discharged for the last time in 1810. And this time he signs his name as Peter Federheim, showing that he was completely anglicized during a long career in the British Army, even though he was born in Germany. And just to show that I'm not a liar about all this, there's a signature on his discharge from the 17th Regiment of Foot. Two more men. Bear with me here. John Overon, born 1751 in Essex. He was 5 feet 7 inches tall, laborer, and enlisted into the 34th Regiment of Foot in 1769. The 34th Regiment of Foot, most of it spent most of their time during the war in Canada. And John Overon was captured during fighting at a place called Fort Windecker along the Mohawk River in October of 1780. And if you were to look at the muster rolls of the 34th Regiment of Foot, you would see that at the end of the war, he never returned from captivity. So he was written off as a deserter. The regiment goes home, he doesn't come with it, he's gone. But there's more to the story because he's a career British soldier. He's not going to just leave the Army. He actually escaped from captivity. And rather than going back to Canada where his regiment was, he had the opportunity to get into New York. So he escaped from captivity, got into New York, joined the 22nd Regiment of Foot in 1781. Well, they're in New York, his other regiments in Canada, they have no communication with each other, so there's no comprehensive Army records recording this. He served through July 1791 and he got a pension. But again, if you were studying only this one regiment or this one region, you would completely miss the fact that he turned up again in the British Army. It's very tricky to follow these people through their entire careers because of these disconnections. One last man. Now, I was told that this audience for the Friends of Valley Forge here kind of favors American soldiers over British soldiers. So I chose this particular guy, and I also chose him as a tribute to the moderator, Eric Schnitzer here. James Cuffe was born in okay, that's a mistake. I believe he was born in 1755. I made this slide yesterday just for this talk, and obviously there's a typo. We'll say he was born in 1755 in Ireland. He was 6 feet tall, light hair, light complexion. He was a barber before he joined the Army, and he enlisted into the 62nd Regiment of Foot in May of 1774. He was captured at Saratoga in October of 1777. He escaped from prison outside of Boston in 1778. And then what's he do? Well, he's a professional soldier. And oh, he's patriotic. He joined the American Army. He enlisted in the 16th Massachusetts Regiment in February 1777. He must have a love of liberty and want to support the American cause of independence, right? Well, maybe not. He deserted from the American Army in May of 1779. Oh, but he came back. All right, not so bad. But if we follow his career farther, By September 1780, he was serving in Bergen County, New Jersey, and he deserted again when he was between Paramus and Newbridge in New Jersey. And what does he do now? Well, he does what British soldiers do. He got into British lines and he joined the British Army yet again in September 1780. Joined the 22nd Regiment of Foot, went home with them at the end of the war. In November 1783, they evacuated New York. Well, then, sadly, he deserted again in June of 1784, so I don't know his ultimate fate, but it shows the kind of unusual career some of these soldiers had. This guy served on both sides, and again, a lot of men did exactly this. He probably joined the American Army as a way of getting an opportunity to rejoin the British Army. Unfortunately, he didn't leave us a written record of his motive, so we don't know for sure. That's all of the guys I have right now. That's the kind of things you'll find in this book called Noble Volunteers. I also might add that you'll find illustrations by Eric Schnitzer, our host, who is also a very talented artist. And if you want a signed copy of the book, there's a URL down here where you can order one that's either got my name scribbled in it or it has an inscription. I'll sign it however you want. This is a local bookstore, and I do encourage you to buy your books from local bookstores or buy your history books from historic sites like Saratoga National Historical Park, because now more than ever, these people really, really need your support. If the bookstore doesn't have it, ask them to order it. They can do that sort of thing. If you like these vignettes about soldiers, I have a blog. If you need to contact me directly, my email address is here, and I'm the editor of a publication called the Journal of the American Revolution, which is an online magazine. I encourage you to take a look at it, and I'll be happy to take any questions anybody here might have.
Thank you, Don. That was absolutely brilliant. I think everybody can see that you leave no stone unturned with your research. Fantastic, including your research on the traitorous Mr. Cuffe there. Thank you for including him. There are some questions in the docket. I'll try to ask them in the order in which they were presented. We have about 15, 20 minutes left for you to do some Q&A, so here we go. First question is, do you know how many volunteered from Cork, Ireland, where the British initiated a major recruitment effort prior to the Charleston campaign?
That's an excellent and interesting question, and I'm going to turn it around just a little bit, because the British Army didn't necessarily initiate a major recruitment effort in Cork specifically. They initiated a major recruiting effort in Ireland as an entirety, and it just happens that Cork was a major population center, so you're going to get more recruitment happening in that area. But every single city and town in Ireland has representation in the British Army during this time period, and recruiting is going on very heavily. Now, to your question about the specific number of men, unfortunately, no, I can't give a specific number. We have a great deal of information about the proportion of men in the British Army who were from Ireland. We have a lesser amount of information about the specific towns and places men came from within the Army. So we can do some analytics, but there's some reasons that I won't get into right now where that data could be skewed somewhat. So I can't give you a number of how many British soldiers came from County Cork, much less Cork City. But there are percentages in the book about the proportion of men who were Irish and about the recruiting efforts in Ireland in general during this time. I will point out that Cork was the major point of embarkation in Ireland when British soldiers who had been serving in Ireland or were recruited there left Ireland to come to America. They left through Cork. So it may seem like the big recruiting effort was going on in Cork. Really, that was where the men were being concentrated after being recruited from far and wide. So you'll see a lot of individual Irish soldiers in this book and some statistical information about recruiting in Ireland, but I can't give you a figure about how many were recruited in County Cork, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, did American colonists join the British Army?
Did American colonists join the British Army? That's an excellent question, and the answer is yes. In particular, they joined the British Army before the American Revolution began, because at that time, think of yourself as an American colonist, and it's 1770, and you're in New Jersey, and there's a British regiment in the area. If you want to join the army, you don't think of yourself as joining the British Army. You think of yourself as joining the army because you're British, right? You just happen to be living in a British colony that's far away from Great Britain. But yes, before the war began, plenty of young American-born men joined the army. Some became officers in the British Army. I do talk some about them in here. Here's another case, though, where we don't have comprehensive figures, so I couldn't tell you the proportion of American-born men who were in the army. Once the war began, that changed a lot. It was still possible for an American-born man to join the British Army, but most of the ones who did were put into what we call loyalist regiments, provincial corps, regiments that were raised in America to fight the war in America against the rebellion in America. So the vast majority of American-born men who served in the British Army during the war were in provincial corps, not the British regular regiments that I talk about here. But there were a lot of American-born men who had joined before the war began in the British Army at the time of the Revolution. Sadly, again, I can't give you a precise figure on that.
Thank you. Excellent. The next question, do you know how many of the British and continental soldiers, but we'll ask about the British soldiers, could read and write, or can you speak to the literacy of the common soldier in that period in the British Army?
I not only can speak to the literacy, but I can speak to it in great detail because I talk about that a lot in this book. Now it's a sort of a two-part question. We don't have a precise figure on literacy except figures that I myself have come up with. The bad part is that most British soldiers didn't leave us any writings other than their signatures. And there's a lot of discussion about whether if a man could sign his own name, does that mean he was literate or not? And that's a whole area of scholarship I'm not going to get into. But based strictly on that metric, because the one thing we have a lot of is signatures. We don't have enough writings to get a proportion in mind, but we do have signatures. So we look only at the signatures, it ends up being somewhere between 50 and 60% of British soldiers were able to sign their own names. And then in the book, I get even a little farther. I start to break it down by soldiers who are from England, the soldiers who are from the lowland parts of Scotland, soldiers from Highland Scotland, soldiers from Ireland. What are the proportions of these men who eventually at some point in their lives could sign their own name? Now, could all these men read and write? Could they read and write really capably? That we don't know, but I do have a lot of examples of soldiers who wrote things, and I have examples of soldiers who were reading things and talk about and convey that information in one way or another that they were able to read. So the answer is some were certainly literate, but we don't know how many. But if you want to know how many could sign their own name, we can really do statistics on that. And again, the book has a lot more detail about that very subject.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. There are two questions that are very related. I'll kind of combine them together. Were there any consequences or punishments for re-enlisting after deserting? It was also asked specifically if James Cuffe was punished upon rejoining either the Continental Army or the British Army.
That's a very good question, and it's great that you bring that one up because I don't talk about that specific question very much in the book. The answer is, the question was framed in terms of re-enlisting after deserting, and I'm going to break that into two pieces because some soldiers deserted and then came back to their same regiment of their own volition, and other ones deserted and were captured and brought back, not of their own volition. And then you had these men who did things like escape from prison or even desert, and then show up in some other place and join another regiment. So there's some different flavors going on here. The answer is desertion was indeed punishable. It was punishable by death. Many men were tried for desertion during the war. Obviously, these were men who came back one way or another. And usually the litmus test was more or less, the man disappeared. Does it look like he was trying to run away for good? Did he take his clothes and everything with him? Or was he just gone one day and then he came back for some reason? And it didn't look like his intention was to be gone for a long time. Was he captured when we found him? Did he come back of his own free will? Or did he try to resist or try to run away? That's a big factor. Now that I'm saying all this, I realize I do talk a lot about some of this in the book. If it looks like a man was trying to desert, and it looks like we captured him and dragged him back in and he didn't want to come back, he's liable to get sentenced to death. Now, he might not actually get executed because there were a lot of reprieves given, but he's liable to be sentenced to death. But if a man did something like escape from prison, so he's part of the British Army, he's captured, he's still a soldier. If he escapes from prison and makes his way back and joins the British Army again, most likely he's not going to get charged for desertion, even though you could argue that he served in the American that most probably he's not even going to get tried. There are a few men who were put on trial and they were pardoned for it. So there's a lot of differences, but the answer is if you came back and you could make a good acquittal of yourself of why it was you came back, and yeah, I came back because I was determined to join the army again, you're probably not going to get tried or punished for that.
Right, thank you, thank you. Don, in your talk, you alluded to the expanding worldwide war, beginning, of course, with the Franco-American alliance. So the British Army has to go to war with France in 1778, the Kingdom of Spain in 79, the Netherlands in 1780, as well as the Sultanate of Mysore. So there's a question here, and it's after 1781, how many British regiments were sent to other areas, such as India or the Caribbean?
That's a slick question. And the answer is, I'm assuming when you say how many British regiments were sent to other places, you mean how many were sent from America to other places, yes? Or do you mean how many were sent from Great Britain to other places?
Right, yeah.
I'm going to accept the question as being how many British regiments left America and then went and fought in other places. The answer is after 1781, hardly any. There were a few of the regiments in America who were then reposted to the Caribbean, but by that time the war had largely wound down in the Caribbean as well. But there were no regiments that were sent from America to India. Now, if we wind it back a little bit and get earlier in the war, we have regiments like the 59th Regiment of Foot that was in Boston in 1775. They were involved in the Battle of Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill. They were sent home in 1776, and then in 1778, they were sent to Gibraltar. And they fought there in the longest siege of the American Revolution, a 4-year siege. So there were a couple of regiments like that that left America early in the war and went to fight in other places. But by the end of the war in America, largely the fighting was winding down in all these other places, even though it was still going on. And the regiments who had fought in America were worn out enough that they were sent back home, and regiments from Great Britain were sent to fight in these other places. Regiments that had stayed in Great Britain for several years, come back up to strength, had fresh men, had fresh equipment, were ready to be sent on overseas service again.
Thank you, Don. Actually, it was just the person who asked the question did clarify he was curious about the regiments deployed from America, let's say after Yorktown, from America to other places. So, yeah.
And the answer is none of them went from America to places where there was a lot of active fighting still going on.
Thank you. The next question, is there any record of the marital status of those who re-enlisted? For example, with the folks who rejoined joined the 54th Regiment of Foot?
Okay, that's a terrific question. And the answer is there are no comprehensive records. I do have records of individual soldiers who re-enlisted. And let me step back a minute. We know in many cases in a given regiment how many men were married, but we don't know which men those were. In any given regiment, we do know some individuals who were married, but I might know in the 22nd Regiment, for example, I might know that 80 men were married and had their wives with them in America. And I might know 5 or 6 of which ones those men were, but not all of them. Then I look and say which men were discharged, which were sent to Canada. I know for sure that some of them were married. We know this very well because some we know they took women and children with them, but we don't have enough numbers to say, oh, most of the men who re-enlisted were married or most of the men who re-enlisted weren't married. We just have individual cases where we know that. It's unfortunate, and I don't talk a lot about marriage in the book, mainly because I'm going to be writing another book about British soldiers' wives in the American Revolution. That's a whole nother topic. But the challenge there is we know how many soldiers were married, but we don't usually know which ones they were, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Another question just came up. It says, your book is heavily focused on the infantry. Do you have any documentation on the soldiers of the artillery regiment in America? And in parentheses, it's 4th RA, which you know to be 4th Battalion, but of course there were also soldiers from companies from the 1st and 3rd Battalions as well, serving in America. So could you speak a bit to how much you talk about the Royal Regiment of Artillery in your book?
I can, and the answer is, and I should have actually mentioned that at the beginning slide, I don't talk about the Royal Regiment of Artillery explicitly very much. I do talk about it a little bit. There are individuals from the Royal Regiment of Artillery mentioned throughout the book, but I don't single them out in terms of trying to look at how they recruited men, the different ways they may have recruited, the different types of men they may have looked for, and the different career paths in the artillery. So yeah, the book is pretty infantry focused. Now, in terms of things in the book, like how did soldiers live? When did they live in barns? When did they live in barracks? What was the hygiene like? What were illnesses like? A lot of these things are going to be common to all soldiers, irrespective of the branch of service. But when you look at the recruitment and the training, yeah, those things are very infantry focused.
Right, sure, yes.
Even
yes,
though
indeed.
you like the artillery, you should buy the book anyway, though.
Absolutely. I think those are all the questions we've had submitted.
Well, thank you so much, both of you.
Now.
I hope everybody here enjoyed the evening. I would like to extend a sincere thank you to both Don and Eric and to all of the Park Alliance volunteers who made this evening possible. Thank you again to our sponsor, the Sharon H. and Bruce A. Bakke Foundation, and thank you for participating in the discussion tonight. I hope you'll join us on Tuesday, February 2nd for our next talk. Historian Todd Brasted will present Continentals, Loyalists, and All Between, Washington's Army and the Raising of the Loyalist Provincial Corps at Philadelphia, 1777 to 1778. That's February 2nd at 7 p.m. Lastly, thank you to the members of the Valley Forge Park Alliance for your wonderful support of Valley Forge. You make our mission possible every day. I wish you all a good night from Valley Forge, and we hope to see you on February 2nd. Good night.